Random numbers are so random.
NFT initiative, no.
Hello and welcome to the HACKADAY podcast. I'm Elliot Williams, editor-in-chief of HACKADAY.
And I'm Kristina Panos, assignments editor at HACKADAY.
This is episode 180. Today we'll be talking tiny CRTs, springy PCBs, and measuring trees. This week in the news, we were looking at Winamp is just coming out with a new release.
Hooray.
Can you even remember Winamp?
Oh yeah, I remember that it whips the llama's you-know-what.
I think you could say that on the podcast, but I appreciate you helping it keep it clean.
I do what I can. 4 years in development.
What? I guess. I mean, what could they add to Winamp? I'm going to have to go figure this out. What could they even add to Winamp to make it better or differenter? More awesome visualizations.
They upgraded the code base from Visual Studio 2008 to Visual Studio 2019.
All right. So keeping up with the times, that makes sense.
But it now requires Windows 7 SP1 or later, so it no longer supports XP or Vista.
Oh no.
Yeah.
You'll have to run an older version of Winamp on your XP machines. Our house window machines are all up to 11 now, so I don't think that's much of a problem for us.
I haven't turned it up to 11 myself. I'm still on 10.
I don't use Windows, so I don't really know what good or harm it does. It seems that every time there's a new version of anything, everybody always complains. So that much I think you can guarantee, but whether that means anything or not, what do I know?
I think I've said this before. It's about time for me to get a new box. I got one on my birthday 2 years ago.
Ooh.
This one I'm using now. So yeah. But it doesn't look like Micro Center they still don't have anything that'll run my truck game, which is literally what it's called, my truck game.
Yeah.
Which requires kind of an insane amount of computing power. Like an i7 and 4 gigahertz is the minimum.
There's a lot of truck simulating going on.
You can put loads on it and it go up steep grades and it simulates everything. Yeah.
Physics sims. Yeah, that could do it.
Well, I was gonna say. The point of that was I was gonna say that I still don't know if I'm gonna switch to Linux or not. I don't see why not at this point. Like the only thing left I think is Notepad++. I can use something else.
Yeah, there are always other editors, and I know this is heresy to say it, but everybody has their favorite editor, but you can always change your favorite editor. It doesn't really...
Yeah.
I think it's always worth shopping around. I did that maybe 10 years ago and made the switch. The unforeseeable, the impossible switch from Emacs to VI, actually.
Whoa.
Yeah, right? I crossed the lines. I've seen both sides of the fence or something like that.
Well, it just proves that you've grown. If you change, then you've grown.
Exactly. The problem is if you switch over to Linux, then you can't run the new version of Winamp.
Oh...
No llama whipping for you. Every time I get a new computer and it comes with Windows, I just take that hard drive and I put it somewhere. Because, you never know when you're going to need it, right?
Picturing this cave full of hard drives.
I think I have a new in-box Windows 7 install back there if you want it.
Oh, nice.
A hard drive I've never plugged in, never turned on, but it's got Windows 7 on it.
That's the best one. Well, that and XP.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
So last week on What's That Sound, I played a not as puzzling sound as I did previously, kind of honestly to make amends for having picked one that was frankly too obscure. I picked one that was a lot easier.
I should know this. It's like Sputnik or something.
Bingo.
Okay.
Ta-da! Yeah, exactly. I asked this one to Dan, and he was like, didn't even hesitate. He was just like, yeah, that's Sputnik. He's like, Dan's like, old radio geek, old radio and space geek, had to know this one. And I'm like, yeah, touche.
I don't remember it being that rapid, but...
Yeah, I didn't either. And actually, if you listen to some samples on the internet, they're slower and some of them are faster. And I couldn't figure out what was up with that. This sample here is from an amateur radio station that was run out of a high school, actually, but they said that they had pretty stable gear and stuff. You can hear the pitch change a little bit halfway through, and that's actually the Doppler effect, because, for a while the satellite's coming at you and then it's going away from you.
Yeah.
And I left that as a bonus question to the audience, and I'll be damned if a whole bunch of people didn't get that one right. That was pretty good. But that thing with the different pulse speeds was confusing me, and I don't know if this is true or not, but Halley writes had fun researching this one. Pulse duration changed based on different states. So it had a different pulse speed when the temperature was above 50 degrees, below 50 degrees, and then below 0 degrees Celsius. And this was their super primitive telemetry, was that it was actually changing its beep rate depending on what temperature range it was in.
Okay, that's really cool.
I learned something from reading the answers to this one, which is pretty good. I like Johan's Sputnik. I used to have that as a ringtone. Who has the
Nice.
Sputnik beeps as a ringtone? Super. But yeah, we got a ton of right answers to this one. In fact, 56.
How many wrong answers did you get?
56 right answers and 3 wrong answers.
Wrong answers.
Man, when you know it, right? So good job. It makes me happy to put one out there that everybody can answer. Makes me feel like a little bit less of a jerk. So thank you, everybody. 56 answers. I will run a little program I wrote. It takes a picture of me with my webcam, does an MD5 hash of that, and then takes the number that represents, which is like a really big number, and modulos it by, in this case, 56. And we'll see. Here we go. Smile for the camera. And the winning number is 2. Wow, that's a randomly low number. Congratulations to High Flux 7, Sputnik.
Hooray.
Short, sweet, to the point. We'll get in touch with you, get a HACKADAY t-shirt out to you. The rest of you listen in next week for another chance to win. All right, well, let's start talking hacks. I'd like to start off this week with Thomas Sandlander's new video, which we wrote up, Go Big or Go Home, 0.6 millimeter nozzles are the future. And what? This is a YouTube video, so it's a little bit polemical. But basically what Thomas is advising here is that you should consider maybe printing with larger nozzles than you usually do. For those of you who don't know, kind of the standard nozzle out there is 0.35 or 0.4 millimeters. And in this video, he's saying go up to 0.6, which doesn't sound like much, but it's kind of a 50% increase in diameter, which actually makes for a, whatever that is, squared difference in volume of the flow coming out. So it is actually a big deal stepping up from one to the other. But you might think that if you went up to a wider nozzle, you'd have to lose resolution and lose the ability to make fine details in the print. And of course, that is somewhat true. But what has changed his mind was some new slicer technology out there, particularly one called Arachne that was introduced through Ultimaker and is now part of Prusa Slicer and is getting backported because it's open source to a whole bunch of other 3D printer slicers. The trick with Arachne is that it reduces the amount of plastic extruded, which then kind of thins up the bead, and so it can do variable bead width, variable extrusion width as it's going through the print, and it can use this to make features that otherwise would kind of get obliterated by a constant width slicer look like they should do. And that's the real secret here in this video, is that Tom's saying, look, I'm getting prints that look as good now with Arachne and a bigger nozzle. There's no reason to not just use the bigger nozzle these days. And that makes a big difference. And he does demonstrate through a bunch of prints that, you know, it's a lot faster if you print it with a bigger nozzle, which I guess we all knew before. But his point here is that through this better software, you can get probably just about the same resolution, except for some extreme edge cases, thanks to smarter software.
What I am going to do sooner rather than later, and I'd be interested to find out if they have different nozzle sizes at all, is get one of those 3D pens.
Ooh, yeah.
I've been researching them, and you can get a pretty nice one for less than $100, so why not give it a try?
I saw a demo of those at a trade show once, and the person doing the demos was incredibly talented. And it was just really awesome to watch her doing this work, right? Like,
Yeah, I bought this piece of art that involves 3D printing. Like, they basically just put down outlines with it and then paint over it.
okay.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I'll put a picture of it up.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, 3D printing is something that hasn't been sufficiently incorporated into mixed media art as far as I can tell. At least I haven't seen much.
Well, I'll show you.
Thank you. Yeah, just to close this out with a personal note, I actually use a 0.8 millimeter nozzle on one printer and a zero point 0.4 on the other. And I highly recommend that because then you've got the choice without even having to, heat up the hot end and pull the nozzle out and readjust it. It's kind of a pain in the butt. If you happen to have two 3D printers around, you might as well leave one for coarse printing and one for fine printing. Just switch up at will. And I did that about a year and a bit ago, and I've found that I use the 0.8 a lot. Even though it extrudes, kind of a really fat old noodle plastic, I actually really like the texture of it, and the strength and the dimensional accuracy ends up being about the same. The strength feels to me anecdotally dramatically increased. The print speed goes way through the roof. It kind of rounds some of the edges that can otherwise be a little bit too pokey when you're making 3D prints. And I actually, if you're doing like a 0.8 millimeter nozzle and then you're squishing it down, that's probably one and a little bit. I think I extrude at like 1.2 millimeter extrusion width, which is, pretty heavy. That puts a good radius on the side of things. So I actually do like the textures that come out of it. I guess you wouldn't use it for small models and for, where having the lines not visible is part of your aesthetic. But as long as you're owning up to it being a 3D printed plastic piece of something, then I kind of like it. If you haven't given big nozzles a try, maybe now is the time. And if you want to try to do that and retain the fine features and make your slicing life.
My first tack this week is a customizable macropad to make anyone's tail wag. And this was built by Gili Yankovic, who's been playing World of Warcraft for almost 20 years now without a macropad.
Oh no.
How they managed that, I don't know.
Yeah.
But after that length of time, they decided enough. I'm going to make my own. And like many of us, I'm going to over-engineer the crap out of it. But whereas some of us let feature creep take over and kill off our projects, Gili is not one of these people, and followed through with quite the macropad as far as customizability. Now, we think we've seen customizable macropads before, but this is a redefinition of customizable. Every key switch has its own AT-Tiny 85 in it. So you can really just put it in any configuration you want and run ribbon cables, connect them up to an Arduino that talks to the computer, and Bob's your uncle. The thing that makes that so easy is the companion programming UI that automatically recognizes any configuration that you put these in.
Ooh.
You start off by choosing the color of the LED, of course. But back to the key switches, they're in a token ring network, which I thought was pretty cool.
What?
To talk to this Arduino. Yeah.
So each key has its own microprocessor, and they all talk to each other over I2C or something. That is completely crazy. That is too many microcontrollers. And so it lets you put them together in any way you want to.
As long as you don't defy gravity or divide by zero, I guess.
Oh, how cool.
And the best part is Gili learned a bunch of things during this process and applied them all. Well, he had learned a bunch of things in the previous couple of years since the before time ended, basically, and applied them all quite well in this project. What is a dendrometer?
Yeah, you're about to find out. Hold on tight. My next hack is Open Dendrometer can measure how your tree feels. This is an entry into the HACKADAY prize by John Opsahl, And I didn't know what a dendrometer was before reading this article and digging into this project. It is basically a distance sensor that you strap onto a fixed point on a tree, and it measures tiny changes in the tree's diameter over time. And so over a long period of time, this will be, the tree's growing and getting thicker. But what John is looking at here is actually day-to-day changes that signal the tree's short-term health. Turns out that if you're able to measure the tree's diameter accurately enough, you can tell if it's got enough water, has the growth rate changed. You could probably see really cool seasonal things. Part of John's experiment here is to, just put this thing together and see what he can see. But it's based on, well-established scientific measurement apparatus or something. Here, he's trying to make it cheap and the hacker way, and that's what I really love about this. He uses a tire tread depth gauge, which is basically like those capacitive slide calipers that we all have these days that are so handy, except it's the short throw version of that. It only operates over like a centimeter or two, and it gives you an extremely accurate way to tell how far away something is on that scale. And so basically he's built a housing for this that he hopes will be waterproof enough to live outside on a tree. You attach a screw to it and you screw it so that this thing is a fixed distance off the tree, so that when the tree grows, it pushes in the little pin that you would otherwise use to measure how deep your tire treads are. And a microcontroller reads that out. He's got an RTC on there so it can timestamp it. I guess he's thinking of using an ESP32 for the final version. He doesn't have that yet for the proof of concept. He's just going to do it wired. But eventually you'd want to do this wirelessly so that you could just, walk through the woods and dump the data from a whole bunch of trees at once.
What is girth worth? Turns out a lot.
And like the idea that you could measure day-to-day, week-to-week tree growth accurately enough that it would be worth saying something about is pretty shocking to me. I really hope that this project moves forward and he's able to figure it out.
Well, it seems to me it's the exterior version of cutting it open and counting the rings.
Yeah, kind of, right?
Counting the rings as you go. Rings plus plus.
The fancier dendrometers a lot of them are analog. I mean, a lot of them are just, physical gears and of course they are astronomically expensive. And in this case, he's able to do it on the cheap with a tire tread sensor and AT Mega 328. So solid if it works. I think it's really cool, and I learned about a new, agricultural monitoring instrument.
Didn't know I wanted that. For my next hack, I chose Smart Modular Keyboard, sports an e-ink display, and a haptic feedback knob. First off, boy, is this thing beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm a little biased by the colorway, the font on the keycaps, and the fact that many of the keys have tooltips printed on them in very small text. Small but legible text. But my goodness, does this have a lot going for it in a small package. This is another sort of lockdown-related project. It started out as a simple project, but it suffered feature creep until it became the ultimate peripheral that its creator, Peng Zhihui, could imagine. I will mention that instead of a keyboard matrix, Peng used shift registers and connected them all to an ARM controller, which I found pretty interesting. You may notice that it has some stuff going on the left side. It's got two screens. I didn't notice the tiny OLED at first, but that OLED goes with that haptic knob. You can program the knob to do different things, and if I'm not mistaken, it changes the detents in the knob based on what you've chosen. And then the larger e-ink screen can show anything you want, weather or tweets or whatever you want. And if it didn't have enough going for it, it also has a USB hub. Something that wasn't mentioned in the write-up that I thought was kind of interesting is that Peng cut long slots in the PCB between the rows of key switches as a method of shock absorption. And I'm not sure what I think about that. I'd have to feel it.
So you think the PCB flexes a little bit more?
Yeah. Some people don't want any flex at all.
Right.
Some people want flex. Some people want membrane keyboards.
True that.
Some people want a keyboard they can use in the shower. Roll it up and go.
Yeah, this one's fantastic. This is the Chinese hacker who did some superb robotics before. I guess he's a software programmer by day, and he has just the most elaborate, well thought out projects that he works on when he's off the clock. You know, the haptic feedback scroll wheel knob thing. Actually, we've seen that project that he got inspired to do this from on HACKADAY a number of times. The haptic wheel with a little round display in the middle. He actually cites that in his video presentation about this thing. And it's using the same trick of having kind of a gimbal motor inside it. And then you can actuate that motor to simulate like clicks or return to center behavior or whatever's appropriate. I remember when we last talked about that crazy, infinitely configurable haptic knob, people were like, well, what would you do with it? And part of this video is the answer to that.
Take that, doubters.
Yeah, booyah. It's the world's fanciest scroll wheel. Next up is another great demonstration project. Homemade saw stop attachment is just about as sketchy as it sounds. This is a video by Ruth Amos, kind of just looking into / investigating whether you could make your own saw stop-like device for a table saw. And saw stop is really cool. If you haven't ever seen their demo, it's absolutely brilliant. They, get the table saw blade up to speed and then they run a sausage into it. The blade stops dead and then retracts down under the table in a split second, so much so that the sausage's skin is like just only barely nicked. And it does this by having a capacitive sensing on the blade itself. So if it runs into a sudden change in capacitance, like it would if you stuck your fleshy finger onto it while it was running, it then stops the blade as fast as it can. And stops the blade as fast as it can is the hard part. Saw stop actually throws a large chunk of aluminum into the path of the blade, and so it just like grinds it to a halt pretty much instantaneously. And then it also has these breakaway bearings that it's mounted on, so then the blade mechanism rotates back and away from you at the same time. So it really makes it hard for you to hurt yourself with a table saw, which is a pretty big achievement. In this video, Ruth is going through a couple primitive ideas to try to drag some metal in there to stop it, like the saw stop model. What she runs into is that the spinning blade tends to kick the piece of metal out, and so it's hard to get it in between the teeth. And I think saw stop must be doing something pretty clever. A, with aluminum so that it's a little bit deformable, and B, I don't know what they use to, kind of explode it into the path of the blade so quickly, but they must do it very quickly so that it's able to get stuck in the teeth. Hers is, there's a lot of sparks, and I think it's steel she uses, and it makes a lot of sparks. Anyway, failed experiment. What does work, however, is that she's got an electromagnetic brake. I think it's from like an old lawnmower or something. And she tries that out, and it's pretty amazing. And what's funny here is she's got Colin Furtz on here commenting on whether he thinks it's going to work or not. And the electromagnetic brake is really heavy. And so she's attached something that's really tremendously heavy to the very fast spinning blade on the table saw, and his prediction is it's going to come lurching at him as you try to slow its momentum down. The actual result is surprisingly good. I was kind of on Colin's and Ruth's side that this looked like a disaster waiting to happen. It works essentially uneventfully. It's really interesting. The downside of doing something like this, attaching a brake to the spinning saw blade, is only that it adds that much more momentum to it. But as long as you can put enough power into that brake, you can actually stop it pretty quickly, it looks like. Totally surprised that worked as well as it did. I mean, she does the same gimmick with the hot dog, and it gets a little bit cut. If it was your finger, you'd be pretty sad about having your finger that badly cut. But it's not going to take your finger off, which is what happens to people who aren't careful around exposed table saw blades. So that's the good news here. It actually does kind of work. The comments on this one are absolutely fantastic. There are people who love SawStop, people who hate SawStop. It's like, on one side, it's a really neat idea. On the other, it's an incredibly expensive device. And so it's out of reach for a lot of people. And it has false positives. So, if you give it particularly wet wood, it might sense the capacitance change and like drop the blade down. And then a lot of the parts are consumable. You have to buy them again. It might do damage to your saw blade. Saw blades are expensive. When it is your finger and you don't have your finger cut off, all of those are looking pretty trivial in comparison, I think. So I hear that. A couple people ballparked, how much energy there is to stop a saw blade in the time it takes to advance one more tooth, which is apparently what SawStop is able to do. That's kind of fun. There's a whole discussion about ways to make table saws safer, which I do appreciate because I have the world's jankiest home-built table saw in my basement, and that thing scares the crap out of me. But basically, in the last 5 years or so, I've completely switched over to using a track and circular saw system basically all the time I would have ever used my table saw. I think I've fired it up like twice in the past 5 years, and my fingers probably thank me for that.
For my next hack, I chose Tiny Arcade uses Tiny CRT. Boy, is it a tiny CRT. I'm on the side of the purists who would rather play retro games and watch retro things on retro hardware. And it's difficult sometimes to find hardware that you can afford to take apart and use that's not going to make somebody upset. It could be Draggle tier messed up and somebody would be mad that you turned it into a ant farm. Hopefully nobody's deeply hurt about the destruction of old video conferencing systems, because that is where the tiny CRT comes from in Marco's project. It had exactly the CRT that he needed. But that's just the beginning. If you watch the video, which is on the longer side, I don't think it has any captions. Well, it has Italian captions. If you watch the video, you get to see him build the custom cabinet, which is about half wood and half 3D printed. And it's very cool. The final product uses one of those Namco joystick all-in-one systems. So nothing super cool and collectible. Had to take one for the team there or anything. It's interesting to see such a small CRT arcade build. Usually they're, at least bar top sized. But it's neat to see one that's handheld.
Oh, this is one of these CRTs that does the side projection. I think I've seen one of these recently in like a Sony Watchman, where it's got a mirror in there and it's a really thin device, and the screen is actually projected upwards basically, and there's a mirror that then turns it out to you. So it makes for a super flat screen, even though it's powered by a CRT, because the CRT is basically thin, flat. It's thin in one axis and it's pointing vertically. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I love those little CRT screens. Some people were fooling around with them in my old hackerspace, and somebody had been collecting them actually, and had the ones that used to go into eyepieces of old video recorders. So like old VHS tape or, God forbid, beta tape video recorders used to let you monitor them live with a little TV screen. And of course, this is before LCD monitors. So what have they got in that little tube that you put up to your eye? It's a CRT screen. And they made these CRTs to fit in there that were kind of, an inch wide, 35 millimeters wide or something. They were really, really tiny and really, really cute. And if you see one of them pulled out of its housing, you just want to make a project with it. You could make this even tinier, and you wouldn't even be able to see the game you're playing.
Put it on your wrist.
Oh, totally.
Make a Pip-Boy. Send it to the tips line.
My first quick hack this week is from Matt of the DIY Perks YouTube channel. Man, he does a lot of really cool optics projects. This one is ultimate bokeh with a projector lens, and he basically makes a gigantic lens, compound lens, out of an old projector lens, and it has the advantage of having a super, super wide aperture for incredibly short depth of field. Anyway, if you're at all interested in lenses and optics, taking this thing that's meant to do one thing and making it work with a camera or even a cell phone camera at the end of the day is quite the lesson in optics. Next up is a video from BitLooney. Hoverboard powered sofa is fun and a bit dangerous. He was up in Berlin hanging out with other HACKADAY friends, Dave Darko and Tiny LED Matrix, and they were playing around with hoverboard motors and attaching them to a sofa. I am super jealous. It looked like they had a great time, and they got to experiment around with eFoo's field-oriented control firmware for hoverboards, which is on my list of things to do. They even found a website where you can compile the firmware for your device on the fly, online, in the cloud. So how cool is that?
Right there from the motorized couch.
That would have been dangerous. Next up, USB drive keeps your secrets as long as your fingers are wet. This is a project idea. It's a halfway begun project by Walker. It, quote, strikes a nice balance of ridiculousness and functionality. Basically, he's taking a USB thumb drive. He's found the chip enable line for the USB interface chip there, and he's proposing to break it out to a microcontroller that then on two pads senses the conductivity between the two. Why? So that when you put your finger over it, it won't necessarily turn on, but if you lick your finger and put it over there, it will function as if it were a normal USB pen drive. This is totally security by obscurity, but it's just goofy enough to have to lick your thumb to get the pen drive to enumerate that I love it. And last up, something serious. This is a research paper by Brown, Soma, Mendoza, No, Mahler, and co. Scavenging CDs for flexible parts. This is a really cute idea. They're basically lifting the metallic film off of old CDs to reuse them, backing them with some adhesive, and then cutting it with like a hobbyist foil cutter like you'd use for scrapbooking. But then they're using these to make flexible sensors for science. It's a really cool paper from Nature. Hacker Spirit, give it a read.
For my first quick hack this week, I chose DIY retrograde clock is 3D printed. Now, if you're unfamiliar with retrograde clocks, and I always forget how they work, here's a refresher. They tell time in the space of a semicircle rather than the full circle to which most of us are accustomed. And they're fun to watch because the hand sweeps about the semicircle and springs back to the starting position when it reaches the end. This one is really nice looking between the clear acrylic face with the slots cut out and the 3D printing. Really interesting part to me is that Jamie made this out of a regular clock movement that you could just get at the hobby store. He had to come up with a bunch of racks and gears to make it into a retrograde clock, but that's the fun part, right? Next up, you can build a giant 7-segment display of your very own, because everyone needs one of these. Seriously, right? If you don't know it yet, once you have one, the uses will just come out of the woodwork. This one was built by Lewis for Lewis's swim club to be their lap timer, and that's part of why it needs to be giant, because you're going to be at least probably 20, 30 feet away from it at all times, and you need to be able to see it from the far end of the pool through your goggles or your chlorined eyes. Cool part is that the build is completely modular, so you could make 2 digits, 10 digits, however many digits you want. I think it'd be a great clock. I like clocks in general. I like clocks of all sizes, especially weird clocks. Next up, when Carl says jump, PCBs say how high. Now, of course, we're talking about Carl Bugeha. Unless you've been living under a rock for the last several months, you may have noticed that he's gotten into flexible PCBs. So the latest foray into flexible PCBs is creating the ideal jumping mechanism that uses nothing more than magnets. How do they work? that uses nothing more than magnets and flexible PCBs. And Carl goes through all kinds of iterations, making squiggly arms, and shows this sheet of flexible PCBs that he got back that's like poster size. So he can try all these different thicknesses and what have you. Some people might ask, what good are jumping robots to us? What are they good for? They're fun to watch. I'm putting a tweet that I saw from Carl last night where he's got a... Have you seen this tweet?
Ah. Okay. That's terrifying. Yeah. Gotcha.
Where he's got the PCB between two big bar magnets, and it's just flapping back and forth at the rate of a hummingbird almost. I think it's pretty cool. Yeah, flight? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not because of the weight of the magnets that you would need.
Yeah.
Who cares if they're good for anything? They're cool. Making stuff like that, you know, the right person sees it and they're gonna make the next awesome thing because they saw this. It's all useful. It's all good, as the kids say.
Looking for new phenomena, playing around with the weird one he's got, trying to figure out what you can do with it.
And we get to watch.
Yeah.
Flappy, flappy, flappy.
All right, that brings us to our Can't Miss articles. These are the long-form pieces that our lovely HACKADAY writers write for y'all. First up, I'd like to pick up Dan Maloney's Ask HACKADAY. What was your first electronics win? Here he tells the story of teenage Dan who was working on lighting in a theater. One of the problems they had was that some of the lighting dimmers were intermittent and would go on, go off. They'd fail when they'd get hot enough. Obviously something was wrong. And Dan's first win here was that he pulled one apart, took it open, and started spraying cold spray all over it, and it worked. And then the cold spray would boil off and it would heat up, and then it didn't work again. And so he'd spray it with cold spray and it would work. Simple stuff, but he found out where the problem was. And so he takes the thing apart, discovers that there's a transistor in there that's probably fried, goes and takes it to his local electronics store, finds a replacement, puts it in, and I'll be darned, the thing works like it did from day one. No more intermittence, no more thermal cutouts. Everything works. And Dan's point of the story is that was when he was hooked. That was when he realized that there's kind of something in this goofing around with electronics thing at all. And he says that started off his lifetime of being an electronic hardware hacker nerd. And I think that's an awesome story. He then turns this question on to the audience because, well, ask HACKADAY. And we get a whole ton of great answers in the comments section. You know, people who worked on amplifiers, replacing dead capacitors in LCDs, which is a great one, actually. Fixing old oscilloscopes, you name it. Everybody has fixed up a lot of things. And that made me think about what my story was going to be. And honestly, the thing that got me hooked on electronics wasn't actually fixing anything. It was building something at all. It was building goofy effects pedals and other kind of funny audio circuits. And all these projects came out of a book, Electronic Projects for Musicians by Craig Anderton. And I don't know, before I embarked on some of these projects, which included, really simple things like distortion pedals for guitars. I was using them on keyboard synthesizers at the time, but that's a whole nother story. I had thought that these kind of effects were super complicated and really difficult. And it turns out a lot of the really cool distortion sounds just come from overdriving a transistor. And so how many parts are in this project? Just enough to drive and / overdrive a transistor, i.e. not many. And it was an awesome revelation for teenage me that you could make all sorts of crazy musical effects out of essentially nothing. And so I guess it's not a repair that sent me on whatever this weird hacker trajectory is, but it was Craig Anderton's Electronic Projects for Musicians. How about you, Kristina?
I would say my first win was when I had the courage to lick my first 9-volt.
A what?
And once I got a taste of electronics, I just...
No, no, no.
I'm sorry, it's committed to the record now. I was trying to think of something I did before trade school, but I didn't come up with anything. So I'm gonna have to go with the first one is building an entire AM/FM radio kit in college. It was like
Oh, solid.
the biggest thing we soldered, because there's, 80 plus components.
Oh, for sure.
It made static when I turned it on the first time. I had to tune up all the capacitors and stuff. I'd like to make it work again.
Ooh, do you still have it?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's the Elenco kit that they offered from 1989 to 2012.
Oh, cool.
If I can find mine, I'll put it up. But I've already found a picture of it online, if not.
Awesome.
But more recently, the one that I'm sure about is that typewriter that I got, that little thermal typewriter. Well, it can be thermal if you have thermal paper, but it also uses very expensive ribbons. I got it and I put batteries in it and I switched it on and the cursor showed up on the little screen, and a few seconds later it went boom.
Ooh.
And then some smoke came out. And yes. And I was sad. But I thought, well, let's see. Maybe I can fix it. Let's see what happened. Probably a capacitor. Yep, it was a capacitor. So I went ahead and I changed all but one capacitor because it was a weird value. I wrote it up. There's an IO project for it. And it worked just fine after that. And I was very relieved for one thing, but it felt really good because I'd really like to use it. Special to me because I've been all the way up in it, inside it, and I had to remove daughter boards and I had to take it apart pretty far to change the capacitors out. So we'll go with that one.
That's pretty solid. This is on the jackass side of electronics. But I think if you asked me what my first memory of that sort of thing was, my dad got me a book, actually a really great old book of his that he had from his childhood that showed you how to build things like a telegraph and stuff like that by wrapping your own coils and bending an old saw blade and, making a clicker, an electromagnet and a clicker out of that. And that was really awesome. And I did that with my next door neighbor who was a few years older than me. And we set that thing up and we used it a couple times, but neither of us knew Morse code or were ever going to. So basically the thing just clicked, but I'd managed to get a 12-volt car battery out of my dad for this thing. And Carl next door is like, let's see what happens if we just take a piece of wire and short the two poles together. It was awesome. All of the insulation burned off, and then of course the thing starts going yellow, and then it starts melting, and you get wire all over the place. It was absolutely fantastic. These two were on the same weekend day, right? On the same day, we built this pretty awesome my house to his house twin telegraph thing that we had read out of this book, and then decided that neither of us could actually use it. And it devolved into burning wires, which was pretty fun too. And that summarizes, no, that doesn't summarize anything. Was that when I was hooked on electronics? Who knows?
All right, for my can't miss article, I chose Jenny List's electrolytes. They're what dehydrated HACKADAY writers crave. Jenny went to MCH, better known as May Contain Hackers. In fact, it was so warm this time that Jenny and crew became dehydrated. Let me stop myself right there. I'm pretty blasé about my health, and I'm working on that. But I will admit to not really knowing when I'm dehydrated or not. I always figure I'm sort of somewhat dehydrated. I try to drink, I drink nothing but water and coffee, and which if I got rid of the coffee, I'd be in good shape probably. But back to the point, Jenny and crew became dehydrated and went to the first aid tent. In the tent, they were given oral rehydration salts. Oral rehydration salts will give you large quantities of sodium chloride, potassium chloride, trisodium, citrate, dihydrate, and glucose all at once, and you should be back to good in a matter of minutes. I definitely am going to carry these around with me because I've been suffering out in the heat on a weekly basis this summer for 8-9 hours at a time. Although I've never really come close to having a problem, It sounds like a good idea. The only thing I've ever tried that's anything like that is Pedialyte, which is for children. Tried it once before I needed it just to see what it was like, and it was really gross. It was really sweet and gross. So, better that than an IV drip in the hospital.
It's really interesting to read the comments here. Like, a whole bunch of people apparently have this problem. And, doing sports and stuff, as a kid, I grew up in Nashville, which is pretty darn hot. And, you do sports and stuff in the summer. We definitely would get dehydrated. But my warning sign was always this headache I got. And it's funny because all of these are kind of related. And if you think about it, your entire nervous system basically does all of this signaling by messing around with relative concentrations of these salts inside your nerves. And so if you have, kind of systemically way too little of it, it could really, I used to get a headache. I don't know if I'm not a doctor. And B, Jenny was saying she got symptoms where she was just like, headache and tired.
And stop sweating.
Yeah, something really, really wrong when you stop sweating. And so went in and got help. And that's good news. But
Or you could just be in some bad Midwestern humidity that's not allowing you to sweat.
98% humidity, don't even bother. Yeah. But it is funny. There's a whole bunch of people who have kind of chimed in here, and there's a bunch of recipes, all of them coming from various sources such as World Health Organization and some sports people, some first responders, emergency medical people. And they all basically have kind of the same mix of a whole bunch of salts in them. So it does make you think that there has to be something there.
I do love salt.
Yeah, right? And you notice that, right? Like if you're out sweating hard outside, you definitely notice that salty stuff it somehow is better, or at least tastes less salty. Yeah, but it's not just salt, right? You need to get that potassium in there and some magnesium and whatever else. None of us are giving out medical advice here because I'll tell you how to solder, but I won't tell you how to rehydrate yourself. On the other hand, there's a bunch of really cool recipes in here, so give it a check.
I'll tell you how to water your plants, maybe, and they might live, depending on the plant.
How much magnesium and potassium do you water your plants with?
Geez, I'd have to get out the water testing kit, whatever's in the, except of course, the Venus flytrap gets distilled water.
Do not water your plants with Gatorade. That wraps it up for this week's HACKADAY podcast. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to reach out to us, send us an email, editor@hackaday.com, or head on over to the comments where we also have all the links for this show over in the show notes, hackaday.com/podcast. If you see anything cool or if you do anything cool, send us a tip, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep on hacking. I'm recording on my side.
There we go. Now I'm recording on mine.
Hooray. I presume it still whips the llama's ass. They've got serious problems if it doesn't. What's that sound?
Super quick break. I'm sweating like a hog up here.
My go-to is congressman under indictment, because you just love to see a congressman under indictment, right?
Quick hacks.
Quick hacks.
Ta-da.
Hooray.